The second rule, الإدغام. It means insertion of one thing into another. The rule of Idghaam is applied if nun saakinah comes at the end of the word and the following word begins with one of the letters contained in the word يرملون. The letter Ya, the letter Ra, the letter Mim, the letter Lam, the letter Waw, and the letter Noon. Then the Noon merges into the next letter so that they become as one. The rule of Idghaam can only take place between two words and not within one word. The rule of Idghaam by using القاعدة الذهبية method. والنون قبل النون أن. It means that nun saakinah is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter noon. The nun saakinah merges into the letter noon. In this case, the idgham is a complete idgham with ghunnah. In the case of complete idgham, the following letter has shaddah, so noon has shaddah. An example with noon saakinah. Min ni'matin. The mistake is to pronounce the idgham without a time for the ghunnah. Min ni'matin. And the right pronunciation is to give time to the ghunnah. Minni. So the right pronunciation is min ni'matin. Another example with nun saakinah, min nakhilin. The mistake is to pronounce it without a time for the ghunnah, min nakhilin, and the ghunnah has time, minna. So the right pronunciation is min nakhilin. An example with tanween. أمانة نعاسا. The mistake is to pronounce it idgham without a time for the ghunnah. أمانة نعاسا. And the ghunnah has time. تنو. So the right pronunciation is أمانة نعاسا. Another example with tanween. توبة نصوحا. The mistake is to pronounce it without a time for the ghunnah. توبة نصوحا. And the ghunnah has time. تنا. So the right pronunciation is توبة نصوحا. والنون قبل الميم أما. It means that nun saakinah is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter mim. The nun saakinah merges into the letter mim. In the case of idgham of nun saakinah with the letter mim, the idgham is a complete idgham with ghunnah. So the letter mim has shaddah because it is a complete idgham. In this case, nun saakinah is not pronounced. An example with nun saakinah, min mali. The first mistake is to pronounce it without a time for the ghunnah, min mali. Another mistake is to pronounce it noon, min mali. So the right pronunciation is min mali. Another example with nun saakinah, min mithlihi. The first mistake is to pronounce it idgham without a time for the ghunnah, min mithlihi. Another mistake is to pronounce the noon, min mithlihi. And the noon is not pronounced when the idgham is with the letter mim. So the right pronunciation is mim mithlihi without pronouncing noon. An example with tanween. Ummatan muslimatan. The mistake is to pronounce it without a time for the ghunna. Ummatan muslimatan. Another mistake is to pronounce the noon of tanween. Ummatan muslimatan. So the right pronunciation is ummatan muslimatan. Another example with tanween. Sa'atan min. The first mistake is to pronounce the idgham without a time for the ghunna. Sa'atan min. Another mistake is to pronounce the noon of tanween. Sa'atan min. And the right pronunciation is with a time for the ghunna and without pronouncing noon. Sa'atan min. وَالنُّونُ قَبْلَ الْيَاءِ أَنْ. It means that noon saakinah is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter ya. The noon saakinah merges into the letter ya. In this case, the idgham is incomplete idgham. So the letter ya hasn't shaddah. In the case of idgham of noon saakinah with the letter ya, the idgham is with ghunna. An ya. An example with noon saakinah. فَمَن يَعْمَلْ. The mistake is to pronounce it idgham without ghunna. فَمَن يَعْمَلْ. And the right pronunciation is with ghunna. مَن يَا. So the right pronunciation is فَمَن يَعْمَلْ. Another example with noon saakinah. وَمَن يَقْنُتْ. The mistake is to pronounce the idgham without ghunna. وَمَن يَقْنُتْ. And the idgham is with ghunna. وَمَن يَقْنُتْ. This is the right pronunciation. An example with tanween. حَسَنَةً يُضَاعِفْهَا. The mistake is to pronounce it idgham without ghunna. حَسَنَةً يُضَاعِفْهَا. And the ghunna has time. حَسَنَةً يُضَاعِفْهَا. This is the right pronunciation. An example with tanween. وَبَرْقٌ يَجْعَلُونَ. The mistake is to pronounce it idgham without ghunna. وَبَرْقٌ يَجْعَلُونَ. And the right pronunciation is with ghunna. قُنْيَا. So the right pronunciation is وَبَرْقٌ يَجْعَلُونَ. وَالنُّونُ قَبْلَ الْوَاوِ أَنْ. It means that noon saakinah is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter waw. The noon saakinah merges into the letter waw. In this case, the idgham is incomplete idgham, so the letter waw hasn't shaddah. In the case of idgham of noon saakinah with letter waw, the idgham is with ghunna. An example with noon saakinah. min waliyin. The mistake is to pronounce it idgham without ghunna. min waliyin. Or to give time to the idgham but without ghunna. This is also a mistake. min waliyin. So the right pronunciation is to give time to the غنة. من ولي. Another example with نون ساكنة. من واق. The mistake is to pronounce the إدغام without غنة. من واق. And the غنة has time. من واق. This is the right pronunciation. An example with tanween. ولي ولا. The mistake is to pronounce it without غنة. ولي ولا. And we must pronounce it إدغام with غنة. ولي ولا. This is the right pronunciation. Another example with tanween. صبغة ونحن. The mistake is to pronounce it إدغام without غنة. صبغة ونحن without غنة. And the right pronunciation is to give the إدغام غنة. صبغة و. Pronouncing the غنة between the tanween and the letter و. So the right pronunciation is صبغة ونحن. والنون قبل اللام ألا. It means that نون ساكنة is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter lam. In the case of إدغام of نون ساكنة with the letter lam, it is a complete إدغام, so the letter lam has شدة. But in this case, the إدغام is without غنة. ألا. An example, نون ساكنة with the letter lam. فملم. فملم. There is no غنة. Another example, and the mistake is to pronounce the إدغام with غنة. فمن لم. Another example, يبين لنا without غنة. And the mistake is to pronounce it with غنة. يبين لنا. An example with tanween. هدى للمتقين. The mistake is to pronounce it with غنة. هدى للمتقين. And the إدغام here is without غنة. هدى للمتقين. This is the right pronunciation. Another example with tanween. خير لكم. The mistake is to pronounce it with غنة. خير لكم. And the إدغام with the lam is without غنة. خير لكم. والنون قبل الراء الراء. It means that نون ساكنة is at the end of the word and the following word begins with the letter ra. In the case of إدغام of نون ساكنة with the letter ra is a complete إدغام, so the letter ra has شدة. And the إدغام is without غنة. الرا. An example with نون ساكنة. من ربهم. The mistake is to pronounce it إدغام with غنة. من ربهم. And the إدغام is without غنة. من ربهم. Another example with نون ساكنة. من رسله. The mistake is to pronounce it إدغام with غنة. من رسله. And the إدغام is without غنة. من رسله. An example with tanween. ثمرات الرزق. And the mistake is to pronounce the idgham with غنة ثمرات رزقا, and the idgham is without غنة ثمرات رزقا. Another example with tanween غفور رحيم. The mistake is to pronounce the idgham with غنة غفور رحيم. And here the idgham is without غنة غفور رحيم.